Hello, I'm Alan Stoga, chairman of the Telberg Foundation, and thank you for joining this conversation about the future of Europe. I think it's easy to start from practically every perspective. Europe is in a bad place. Inflation, energy crisis, recession, political tensions, social tensions, the war against Ukraine, and all of the consequences from that war. Even more importantly, I would argue that key elements of Europe's grand strategy are in trouble. Dependence on cheap Russian energy has ended catastrophically. Reliance on soft power, while effectively disarming, has proven not to be such a great idea in the mid-21st century. Deep economic and trade ties with China might turn out to be less of a good idea, particularly as the US and China seem to be moving increasingly towards confrontation. The relationship between France and Germany has been central to Europe's successes of the last decades. That relationship, regardless of who's in power in Berlin or in power in the Élysée, has been a core driver of Europe's success. Now, however, we seem to be in one of those periods where the countries are out of sync. Their leaders don't seem to be reading from the same playbook. They don't seem to have a shared vision of where to take Europe. Europe, as I said at the start, is in trouble, at least in part because the Franco-German relationship seems to be in trouble, and the vision of the future is at best cloudy. So today we're going to discuss the future of Europe, particularly through the lenses of Germany and France. To do that, we have Laure Mandeville, who's a senior reporter at Le Figaro and a widely published author who's just published a book, in fact, which we need to make mention of, Laura, about Ukraine. And Friedbert Pflüger, a former CDU parliamentarian, state secretary for defense, a successful businessman since he's left public service. We have already shared much more extensive bios, and you will find them in the chat as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Laura and Friedbert, for the conversation we're about to have. So let's start this at 100,000 feet and then gradually descend towards reality and Earth. Why, if you agree, are your two countries so out of sync with where Europe should and can go? Laura, may I ask you to start?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, first of all, Alan, for inviting me to this discussion on the future of Europe in a time of such big danger, and at the same time, I would say, a time of opportunity, because everything is in, as you said, is in flux. Everything is unraveling in a way and changing. So, of course, we need to take the time to think through what's going on and what has gone wrong in order to plan and be in time for constructing the future. So I wanted to actually also thank Pierre Lelouch, because that's Pierre Lelouch, who is a former Minister of European Affairs of France, for putting me in touch with you, because I wouldn't be talking to you without him. So being a journalist, I am not a diplomat. It's a privilege in a way, and I hope it will help me not be too diplomatic in this conversation. The first thing I want to say before addressing your question, about France and Germany, is to stress again. I know you don't want to talk too much about Ukraine, but to stress to what extent Ukraine is a game changer, and that we have actually in France, in Germany, in Europe in general, and in America, participated in a total strategic disaster because we overlooked the threat that Russia represented. There was an absolute mistaken approach to Russia. And there was so much blindness, so much self-satisfaction, I would say, also corruption in a way, or at least rapaciousness, to make a lot of money, that we just behaved in I would say, in a very strategic lightness. And there were many voices actually, sort of shouting and screaming in the desert concerning what was coming, the coming catastrophe coming from Russia, but it was not heard. And I think there is a real autopsy of the mistakes to be made before we move on. I mean, or as we move on to addressing the future, because without, this autopsy, I don't think we can actually get out of the paradigms which sort of led to the catastrophe. And the second thing I want to say is that, before addressing Franco-German, we have to tell that the Central and East Europeans were right. They were right in their vision of the threat coming from the East, from Russia, the Putin's Russia. And they screamed also in the desert, not only the experts in the West or journalists or, different think tankers. And there was a lot of condescendence, I would say, and blindness, both in Berlin and in Paris. And the fact that Eastern Europe, Central Europe was right actually changes the game in Europe. And it absolutely is moving, it gives them now a growing position of strength because they were ready. And I think they have answered the call of the Ukrainian crisis quicker than we did. And their role is going to, be increasing, I think. And in this same basket, I would say that we have to, the third element I want to stress is that we are seeing this sort of center of gravity is moving to the east, and we have the emergence of Ukraine as an absolute game changer for European future. This is the title of our talk, and because we have 44 million people emerging on the horizon who were not, in fact, really on our mental and geopolitical maps. We actually always overlooked Ukraine. We sort of went over and saw, the Russian power, the Russian geopolitical weight, but we didn't see Ukraine. And Ukraine is there, and it's according to a French colonel who's actually become very famous on French TV because he's actually observing every day and giving comments on Ukraine's military operations. And he says that Ukraine is at the moment the strongest army in Europe, not the French, not the German, it's the Ukrainian army in terms of, capacity, combat readiness, etc., etc. It's maybe a bit provocative to hear such thing, but I think it's really interesting. I can see you want me to stop here.
Stop
okay.
Just for a second, because I'd like to pull Friedbert in and maybe ask the same question. The Franco-German relationship, but as Laure just said, we're in a place where nobody expected to be. We all knew there were problems in Europe. We all knew there were issues in Europe. We all knew after Brexit, a word that doesn't get mentioned anymore, that the locus of gravity in Europe would shift to the east. We didn't know that this would come along and shift it even faster and perhaps further. So how do you look at, again, from 100,000 feet, Friedbert, how are you looking at the moment?
Well, thank you, Alan. In the moment, Chancellor Scholz is visiting China. And unfortunately, he is there alone. I don't know which let him, not take on the invitation of Mr. Macron, that the two go together. I think it would have been a wonderful sign of German-French unity and a strong signal towards the world if the French and the German leader would go together to China. To do this alone is, in my point of view, in this situation, a mistake. And I believe that the world is heading, unfortunately, in a G2 direction. There is a growing polarization between the United States of America and China. And I don't know if any one of you have read Graham Allison's wonderful book about the destined for war, the Thucydides trap. Mm-hmm. It says that China and the US are going against each other, and it will end most probably in a big world war. Like in the antiquity, it was the incumbent Sparta and the challenger Athens who inevitably, almost inevitably, came to war with each other. And I believe this polarization is the greatest threat to mankind. And what is the European position? The European position, in my point of view, should be one of a moderator. It should be one of, well, at least we should formulate our interests. We don't do that. We go alone to Mr. Xi Jinping, who has just been re-elected and who is a stronger dictator than ever. And he has clearly said that he wants to invade sooner or later Taiwan. So in my point of view, the main challenge is a G2 world, and I would favor, and I absolutely believe that in general, the majority of the French people want the same thing, a multipolar world. Of course, with strong ties within the Western countries, in the democratic camp, strong ties with NATO and the EU, but also a strong European voice. And for the time being, I only hear that Europe is, Brussels is echoing what is coming from the United States. And we have no weight in the relationship. And the US has become so strong with this war. Militarily, it has always been number one, but it's strengthened again. Germany bought immediately when the war started F-35 fighter planes in the US. We have our own fighter planes in Europe and our own developments. Secondly, digitally, US is stronger than anybody else. Now, the United States is also the energy power number one, the energy exporter number one. A few years ago, it was an importer of oil and gas. Now it brings LNG to the world, it sells coal to the world. And with this new IRA program, this Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which pushes $369 billion into the energy market, into renewables, into hydrogen. It will also be in this field where Europe was in lead, become the number one, and European companies are already shifting their investments to the United States. So we see the danger with this war, the danger of deindustrialization. We have no cheap energy anymore. And it's very easy to say, well, this was a dependence. It was the only way for Europeans to be competitive. And therefore, I believe we are heading in this dangerous direction. And if I then imagine Donald Trump becoming president in the United States in 2 years, I think this is a world that we in Europe cannot wish for.
Well, I wore a black vest. I should have worn a black armband, I think. But let's roll that forward. Clearly, you've both said, as I did in my introduction, that Europe's in a bad place. The signal of the trip is a bad one. The noise out of the recent meeting between the chancellor and the president certainly did not sound like there was agreement on where Europe should go. So we understand the problems. Laura, can we get to someplace better? How do we get France and Germany back on the same page? Is that possible? Or do we have to wait for the war to do more damage?
Actually, on the one hand, I do agree with many things that were said by Friedbert Pflüger, about, the necessity to face China together, the need for reindustrialization of Europe, and, making choices that would favor European industry and not necessarily American industry when it talking about the plane of the future or the tank of the future, and there is actually a huge worry in France about the future German choices on on that matter. But at the same time, I think we should not position our discussion of the challenges ahead in terms of are we going to exist as Europe versus the US? And fearing that the US, that everything is going to be about the US and China, because we are facing, despite the fact that we do want to exist as Europe, we are facing the same threats. I mean, what is happening in China and the way the Chinese are, investing massively in Europe and trying to control more and more and using their technology, and all these elements should, lead us to think through this threat together with the Americans. I mean, I understand that there is this also this French, worry that we should not align, etc. But it's the same as for Ukraine. At the moment, I don't believe that the question is to try to have a specific European voice. We have to defend our interest, of course, but we will defend our interest if we are strong militarily. For instance, what I see is that without the Americans, we would be in deep trouble. Ukraine would be down, and we would be on the front line of a potential aggression with the Russians. And what we have to realize is that we disarmed since the end of the Cold War. This was an absolute catastrophe that we thought we were going to use soft power and exist, under the umbrella of the Americans, while criticizing them for putting this umbrella. And what I understand is that there is certainly a transactional or a discussion to be led with the Americans. They do want to concentrate on China. And I think even the Republicans, I was talking to some Republican hawks, China hawks in the US, they were actually willing to envisage the idea that they would have to share in terms of defense industry with the Europeans if they want the Europeans to become a strong military player. Because they've kept saying that they want Europe to be a strong player in Europe and to be the ones to face the Russians. But if we do that, that means that they have to share the market in terms of defense industry. And I think that up to now, what happened is that the Americans were actually sustaining 70% of the protection of the bulk of the defense budget for protection of Europe. So that was implying that indeed we would have to, the Europeans thought they had to buy everything Americans. And I think that could change, with a serious discussion with the Americans. So I'm worried about, dividing the ranks of the West at this very moment. I'm more aligned, and you would say it's not a totally French position, but I think that the French have been. There are several things. You asked me about this Franco-German thing. I think that we have two crises. We have the German crisis, which is a crisis of the model, of the economic model, and the model of being German that they chose for so many years. And suddenly they see this model is down. They cannot continue to buy this cheap energy from Russia, and the model is not sustainable. They have the problem with China. So they have started to rethink totally what they should do. And I understand that they are still under shock, but at the same time, I see them at least, rhetorically aligning a strikingly new approach to strategy and politics, because they're talking about a military revolution, putting $100 billion for a new army in Germany, thinking about a Europe that would be moving east. They want to enlarge it, So this is strategically bewildering. But I would say that it's the crisis of Europe is stronger for the French. Why? Because actually, Europe.
Can you hold that thought just 1 second? Let me get Friedbert respond to your comments on Germany, with which I agree, by the way, many of them, and then come back to your position on.
Yeah, because it's key to understand the French. I think the French are in a much more difficult place, actually, and I will say that, you know, after he responds.
Thank you, because I want to pursue that. So Friedbert, Laura described the problems with the strategy, the rethink that's going on, the notion of rearming. All of that takes time. You rebuild an army, it takes a decade. It doesn't happen overnight. So how do you see the German challenge?
Well, let me first of all say, so that you understand where I stand, I don't want to have quarrels or difficulties with the United States. I've always been a strong believer in the alliance. Was also in my active time as a politician, one of the front runners of NATO enlargement and of strong military forces. So when I was Deputy Minister of Defense, I always said, well, we should not only look for out of area capabilities, but also for capabilities for defending ourselves. So that the continent, most of us did underestimate the continuous threats that are here in Europe. I think that is without question. It's also without question that after this brutal attack of Putin towards Ukraine, we cannot go back to the energy agenda as it was, even if a peace treaty would be reached, which I do not see on the horizon. But even if that happens, this is a clear signal. We have to diversify much more: green gas, hydrogen, e-fuels, a lot of other possibilities, of course, renewables, energy efficiency. So we need a new energy policy without any doubt. Definitely there were mistakes. But what I'm saying now is we should define our European interests, not against the US, but self-confident. For instance, I always liked the French idea of Monsieur Juppé in the times of Charles de Gaulle, who said, let's do some dissuasion concertée. Let's bring the Germans and Europe under the nuclear umbrella of France. And don't underestimate this nuclear umbrella. It is not as strong as the United States or Britain or Russia, but it is very effective. And I think we have lost that debate. Monsieur Macron in the Merkel years, a few years ago, made a lot of, in my point of view, very constructive suggestions of bringing Europe closer together, speaking with one voice in foreign affairs. The response from Germany was not sufficient. Energy-wise, I believe it was a mistake of the Germans to criticize France time and again for nuclear, for going nuclear with their energy, but at the same time be very open for every power they could get from nuclear power plants from France. The same is true right now. We criticize fracking in Germany, and with fracking we could do a lot to diversify from Russian gas, from other gas sources, but we buy at the same time LNG with fracked gas from the United States. So right. There are so many problems that we see and which we have to fight together. But a stronger European voice within this alliance is something which I would like. And I must say this again, Mr. Biden, in my point of view, is a very smart politician. He is doing economically better, digitally better, militarily better. Nevertheless, he might lose the midterm elections and even lose in the next presidential election. But the agenda of the United States, whether it is Biden or Trump is more forceful, Biden is more diplomatic, but it is an America first agenda.
Yes, yes.
And we should be very, very looking to it, that we try to look to it that we remain partners and not become vassals.
Let me use that for an advertisement. On November 17th, we're going to be doing another of these webinars that will focus on what happened at the midterms and what it means for the 2024 election. So the answer to your question about Biden or Trump in 2024, tune in on and we'll send invitations around on the 17th, same time, same place, Zoom land. But let's go now. Laura, you started to say that Germany's in a bad place, but France is in a worse place.
Yes, I think France is in a bad place, and maybe worse place, because it's the whole vision of Europe, of the French, which is falling apart at this moment. Because the European project, excuse me if it sounds a bit arrogant, but I think the European project was a French project, in fact. From the start, it was a French project to put a kind of framework, a kind of, I would say, nearly straitjacket on Germany after the end of the war, and make sure, things would be okay, and Germany would stay, in the realm of European democratic politics. And after the end of the Cold War, it remained the French project, because we continuously, I think the French, the sort of unspoken truth about the French vision of Europe was that this project, this Europe, was going to become some kind of supranational project. It was to go beyond. It was a post-national project I think in the heads of practically the whole French elite, aside from the sovereignists who emerged, quite recently in a way, as vocal actors on the political stage. And so that means that we projected this idea that it would become a post-national Europe, and also, the unsaid truth that was that, the engine of this Europe was the economy of Germany, and the French were at the helm of the strategic and political decisions. And now with this sort of revolutionary situation that we see, the Germans now, recovering because of this sort of electroshock, this shock of the current situation, feeling the urge to recover a real military policy. At least that's what is spoken. I'm not sure all the military people agree in Germany that the politicians are sufficiently active in putting this rhetorical aims into action, but it's just the beginning. I think it sends a shockwave in France, and a strategic shockwave, because the French have to rethink everything. For them, in fact, I think that in this Franco-German couple, the real lover of the couple was the French. And the French, they are like a lover who suddenly feels fooled, because he feels that the other person didn't really love him and is leaving. And I think that the French have to be more realistic in the fact that we will probably never go beyond a Europe of nations, even if Europe can get strengthened in many ways, on many projects, and project power on the important issues, as Friedbert Pflüger advocates, and I totally agree with him that we should not become vassals, but to not become vassals, we have to be strong. And one of the problems of the French is that in order to be able to be a key player in the future of European politics, and a credible one, they have to regain economic power. We have lost an important part of our, power of influence, because we are losing economically to Germany. We have, replaced an industrial policy by an economy of debt. we are deeply indebted, we have lots of problems, and I think we are less credible. And at the same thing, I think at the same time, I think that, you know, at the moment when Germany, you know, is clearly the economic, you know, powerhouse in Europe, and is intending to become a military powerhouse, which is for the French quite big news and difficult to assess, even if we pushed for it. Now that it's maybe happening, there is a worry, let's say, and sort of a bewilderment. I think that the French also have a lot of cards to play in this game to balance everything, because the Central Europe is, of course, politically and economically, I would say, the natural region of Germany. But there are a lot of resentment towards Germany in this region. There are lots of tensions, and you know, the Poles are trying to, at the moment, you know, talk to the French to rebalance the relationship with Germany. Same thing in Prague. So I think there are lots of things happen, very interesting things happening. And of course, the Franco-German couple should remain, if not, you know, sort of mythical and I think over maybe it should not be too much emotion, but more pragmatic steps, going back to you know, the importance of the dialogue. Indeed, I think that this China story is absolutely key, and that's one of the key projects where the French and the Germans should talk together. And then there is I think everything should start from our answer. If we want Europe, as you say, not to be a vassal, we have to gain win the game on Ukraine, because this is the crisis we are actually faced with. If we win this crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, then we can talk about having a strong Europe as a strong actor, etc. And we should not be mistaken by that we have to win this. Actually, we have to win this crisis on Ukrainian side, because at the moment it is impossible to construct a policy with Russia and to plan a peace with Russia without this war to be won. I mean, the hurricane, the neo-totalitarian hurricane, which is blowing from Russia, has to be stopped. And indeed, what we have to recognize, and here I'm talking as an expert of Russia, because I covered Russia for 30 years, and that we have underestimated the fact that in 1991, we didn't get out of the Cold War. Actually, in 1991, we didn't do what we had to do. We actually, in this European apartment, we left one room with Russia, which started again to behave, you know, as a criminal state. And we thought that, okay, we will leave Russia in this room, and it will sort of indeed come into our rooms, but that would be okay. We can hold our rules and order in our part of the apartment, and let Russia be itself and with its you know, more authoritarian dictatorial ways. But what is happening is that it doesn't work. So we will have to settle for good, you know, the situation, and so with Russia, and after the war is finished, to re-establish, you know, a peace which is based on a trial of communism, on a reassessment of Putinism, and maybe trial of Putinism. And you know, on justice.
So my many points to that long speech, but my fear is that this claim for a complete victory and complete surrender of Russia is not realistic. Before they will concede a defeat, I fear that really the nuclear option is on the table. So I believe it would be wise. Of course, we cannot let Ukraine lose that war, but at a certain moment, I believe we have to find some sort of peace treaty, some sort of alignment. By the way, I do not know what comes after Putin. I fear that will become worse. That will become warlords, much more radical people. So the idea of, you know, always putting new weapons, always being tougher, new sanctions on the table, and believe that one day Russia will concede complete defeat seems to me very naive.
How do you see peace?
No, I speak, and I also listen to it. I doubt that this is the right course, and it is a very dangerous course. Secondly, when it comes, and I doubt that it is the French position. It's not Macron's position. And
no, it's not.
Macron and Scholz were very close with each other, that they always try to find ways of diplomatic keeping doors open, and I would encourage both to continue with that. My second point is, you said that it was only the French who loved this couple idea. No, that's not true. I was educated my whole life politically, and I saw that from all political parties, the German-French engine, and not only the engine, the friendship, is the best and the most important thing that happened after the war, bringing two arch enemies together. And I've experienced it hundreds of times in France, and well, that is not only one-sided. I'm sad if you say that this is the feeling now in France. We have to work very hard on it, that we overcome that, because I agree, without this engine being on track again, we have never a chance to be a strategic player in the world. And then, of course, it is true that we need the United States, as we do not want to become Russian or Chinese or have another democratic model. No, we don't want that. And therefore, this German-French thing is so enormously important. My last point, you talked about the necessity of becoming economically strong again. What we see in the moment is deindustrialization, at least in my country. Because of higher energy prices. Well, a company like BASF, the chemical industries, the automotive industries, aluminum, steel, all the heavy paper, all the heavy industries relied on Russian cheap gas. And you can easily say that was a mistake. The German economy wanted it. It worked for 50 years. Our European partner lived with this. Many profited from it. So this breaks down, but the consequence should be clear to us. The consequence is that huge companies cannot afford their energy bills anymore. By the way, also not normal people, and that will also pose a social revolutionary problem. But companies will leave the continent and will go elsewhere. So the result of this war is America stronger than before, Russia weak, Europe very weak, and China very strong. So it's heading towards a G2 world. That's the outcome of this. And I think we should try our utmost to stop it, and not just sit there and say, we have to win, we have to do everything what Mr. Zelensky wants. Yes, we have to take them very serious, we have to support them, but we have to make also clear that, well, for instance, we as Germans get a lot of criticism from Ukraine, but we are badly suffering. Our industries, our people are badly suffering. And for us, inflation rates, that is all very difficult to bear, and we pay a price for this war.
So let's leave the war just for a second, because I'd like to move to practical matters. Obviously, we are in a bad place. Obviously, both your countries are in bad places. How do we get out? What practical ideas? Who should do what to try to recreate a vision for Europe, to recreate the practicality of France and Germany working together, working separately to solve their problems, but working together to solve Europe's problems? Is that possible? Or are we just in one of these death spirals that Europe's best days are in the past? Laura?
Well, it seems to me that the way things are evolving is going to create more challenges for this relationship. I mean, if we are realistic, and talking to some French people in from different circles, Europeans, they are mentioning that they have the very strong feeling that Germany at the moment is playing, on for instance, on defense industry issues against the French, against the French being the adversary on these issues, and the fact that they, chose to the project, which was not, the project agreed with the French on missile defense, that they favored, as Friedrich Pflüger mentioned, the F-35, etc. I mean, that seems to threaten actually what was the seen as the very important field of European defense. So if it continues and this Franco-German plane and tank of the future is not defended, I think it will be the end of European defense. And as Friedbert said, indeed, it plays in the hands, of other players and the Americans. So, but so I do believe that it's a big problem. But I wanted to go back to the idea that when you're talking about making peace, I just don't understand on which basis at the moment it is possible to make peace. We are faced with an adversary, Putin, who believes he's at war with the collective West, and who is using nuclear threats to actually force us to give up. But the problem is that if we give in, to these threats, then it's the end of nuclear deterrence, because he can use it again for anything he decides to do. And I don't see how, if we would sign an agreement with Putin on a potential peace, and accept, that 20% of the territory of Ukraine can be swallowed in a moment, then how can we be sure that the next day is not going to head for Kiev? I think he would actually do it. And my understanding of Russia, after studying Russia for so many years, is that it would be seen by him as an absolute weakness of the West, and he would feel absolutely free to go forward with any plans that he would actually conceive. And then there is one thing I wanted to add to this whole mix, of very indeed dangerous, trends that we have both, summed up, is that in fact we are all the more in the bad place because we are at the confluence of two crises. Actually, we have the geopolitical crisis coming from Russia's threat and Russian aggression against Ukraine, which is putting everything in flux and chaos. But we also have a very deep crisis, political, I would say even civilizational, even, and a disruption, a gaping, a gap, a sort of growing gap between the elites and the people within our societies. In the West, we have a democratic crisis. And I think that Putin would never have invaded Ukraine if he hadn't considered we were extremely weak. And I think that indeed, we will not be able to be a strong powerhouse, with a strategic game if we don't solve our own issues. And it's the same, and the Americans actually are also under threat from this point of view, because we are deeply divided, and we are, I would even say, in a state of hemiplegic disease, that one part of the political spectrum in our societies, it's a case in France, but I think it's a case across Europe, is obsessed with the question of, for instance, the consequences of Islamism in our societies, which is a very deep existential problem for us. and and mass migration continuing and disrupting our societies. And the other part of the political spectrum, and that leads the people who are worried, and especially on the far right, the right, etc., to consider Mr. Putin as a partner, and even hoped that he could be a solution, and not facing this threat. They didn't want to face the threat of Russia. And on the other side of the political spectrum, you have the ones who don't want to consider the internal problems inside our society and total denial of these problems. And I think that the fact is that we do have to think several threats at the same time. And we have burning problems inside and burning problems on our border, the Russia issue.
I agree with much what you said. I concede that it is very difficult to see how a peace treaty could look like in the moment. At least I hope for some signals. We have the G20 meeting in Bali. At least some signals that one thinks of a possible solution, that one wants to prevent further escalation. But perhaps that's an illusion. I agree, it is very difficult, but also difficult is your course in just continuing and saying, well, we have to win this war. This might also lead, in my point of view, in a catastrophe. What can we do? That was Ellen's question. And as I said, I believe this is absolutely necessary that the two countries come together, Germany and France, and perhaps they need, some education, especially the German chancellor, who is still new in the field of international affairs. All chancellors and all presidents, whether they liked each other or not, have understood in post-war history since '63, the Élysée Treaty, that they have to become friends. Mm-hmm. And sooner or later that was possible. Even some, Helmut Schmidt and Giscard, completely different types, but they really managed to come very close to each other. Kohl and Mitterrand, Schmidt and Chirac, Schröder and Chirac. So you name it. It never was, at the beginning, we had deep difficulties between Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel. A little bit later, they were what was it called? Merkozy. So they were very close with each other. So they probably have to meet in Aix-en-Provence or somewhere in a little village in Provence without press, stay there for 3 days with the very closest advisors and come out with a common agenda, how to fight deindustrialization, how to establish European defense, how to save a European defense capabilities, how to deal with the United States, with China, and so on. That if that doesn't work, I agree, and here we are completely agreeing with each other, Laure, then I agree we will not be a player, but others will play with us.
Now, let me do two things. One is to encourage anyone who has questions to put them in the Q&A box on your screens. And two, to connect two dots. A week ago, we had a conversation about the future of Europe with a Spaniard and a Swede. And it was fascinating that they agreed that the Franco-German relationship is in trouble. But they went beyond that and argued that the new Europe must be a Europe, or could be a Europe, is maybe a better way to put it, not driven by Franco-German, the relationship. That may be wishful thinking, because these two economies, your two economies, are by far the largest in Europe. But absent what you just said, Friedbert, absent a coming together both within each of your countries, but also between your countries, then indeed the rest are left to figure out a Europe that is no longer driven by German economy and French imagination, which has been the case for decades.
Right.
By the way,
is a possibility, but what do you think?
Ellen, if I may answer to that, German-Franco relationship never meant, for instance, for Helmut Kohl, just to concentrate on Germany and France and dictate that to the others. But how it really worked was that the French and the Germans had some difficulties, and then they aligned with other countries, and everyone brought the Italians, the Spaniards, the Northern Europeans into the room. Jean-Claude Juncker once told me the enormous strength of Helmut Kohl was that he never did muscle flex in the room. When he sat together with the heads of state of the other EU countries, he acted, as a matter of fact, as if he were from Luxembourg. So everyone knew that it was not Luxembourg, but Germany. But what Mr. Scholz is now doing, and I'm not saying this for party political reasons, he plays again this strength card. And that's very bad, because the German-French relationship can only function if it is accepted by the rest, if they see it as an added value. It would have been wonderful to bring the French and the Poles into this German-French thing, as we have tried with the Weimar Triangle, and that has worked quite well. I always said Poland is our France in the East. So we hope that Poland would be a constructive partner. Unfortunately, with this government that they have right now, they are not. So that is very, very difficult in the moment. But again, Scholz and Macron, with their closest advisors, should meet without press for a longer time and then come out with a common vision of Europe. And I think that's possible.
Do you think it's possible?
I think that it is possible to show, you know, political will, but I think it's going to be complicated. I think and I think that we shouldn't also. I mean, yes, it has to remain, you know, an absolute aim, you know, to continue this relationship as well as we can. But I think we should not also, as Friedbert said, I think that it's not the exclusive couple at the same time. I think that indeed Poland should be an important partner. And I am of the idea that, you know, despite that, you know, the Polish government is not particularly liked, you know, across Western Europe, they have proved during the crisis with Ukraine that they were a very important player, and they are, you know, playing a super important role militarily at the moment, and, you know, supplying a lot of aid to Ukraine, welcoming very heroically, you know, millions of Ukrainian refugees. And, you know, Friedbert was telling us that we are suffering from the crisis. Yes, we do. We are suffering from the crisis, and Germany is suffering. But
they do more. No doubt. They do more.
The Poles are suffering much more. And sure. What I would say is that we have to recognize that, I think you said, we are paying a price for this war. But what I think that the problem that the West Europeans have to realize that they had totally forgotten is that, yes, there are moments when you have to pay a price to get to peace. And we are at one of these moments, and we are very lucky that at the moment the Ukrainians are paying the price of blood, and we only have to pay the price of gas or the price of you know, electricity, and or you know, raising, having more weapons, producing more weapons, etc., etc. But it could be worse. It's what I'm trying to say too, that the situation is very dire. It's extremely dangerous. Again, I think we should not, I mean, the German and French politicians have totally underestimated the dangerosity of this regime. And when you're saying that it could be worse in Russia, I'm not totally. There is a faction, but it was actually created, and Putin was riding this fascist, actually absolutely fascist ideology, which has enveloped the whole elite, Russian elite, and it's very frightening what's going on, and it's not over yet. So I think from that point of view, I'm insisting on the fact that we have to support Eastern and Central Europe, and that this should be more and more associated, with the decision making, because precisely because they predicted and they were on the forefront of many issues. At the same time, I would agree with Ana Palacio, because I listened to some excerpts of the conversation that was taking place, last week, and I think she was very right also to remind everyone that the Mediterranean issues are not disappearing, and that our East European friends should be aware that the problems for Europe and the challenges and are, also coming from the south.
Thank you for that. We have time. Friedbert, would you like to respond to that? But you've put something on the table for our next conversation, which is values. We've spent the last couple of years in Europe worrying about Eastern values, that Poland's values were different from the values in the West. And we've seen issues over the justice system. We've seen issues over gender rights. We've seen all sorts of issues which have faded into the background with the more existential question of war, but are still there. So for a future webinar, we're going to have that conversation. But Friedbert, we're out of time. So last thought. How do we go to a better place?
Well, I agree with much what Laure said. A better place. Well, I would be happy if we could say we are able to prevent catastrophe, and really going down of our economies and societies of polarization. I see all that being possible, and it might be difficult. And it might be in the short run only a sign of will, as you said, Laure, but there's no alternative that the two leaders of our two countries come together and find a common agenda. And that is, I think, the strong appeal where we both agree. We both do not want to be against the US. We understand the importance of it right now, but we want to be more than vassals. We want to be partners, serious partners. And the precondition, I completely agree, is strength and building up our not only military forces, but basically our economic forces again. Whether that is possible or not remains to be seen. I would also tend to be more pessimistic, but there's no alternative for anyone who is politically responsible to try his utmost.
Thank you both for the past hour. I've just finished reading a book whose title might apply to this situation. The title of that book is Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse. So I'm afraid that does seem to be where we end up this hour. Again, thank you, and thank all of you who have spent this past hour with us. Send us your comments, your thoughts, and we'll try to get back to you. And we will do more of these webinars in the future. Again, thank you very much.